That means it's time to start. So welcome everyone to our second Fish Tales lecture series of the year. Today we're going to learn about walleyes. And of course, before we get started, I always want to talk about what's coming up. And those on Zoom, if you could read the housekeeping details. In 2 weeks, we'll have Lee Kernan, a former fisheries chief of the Wisconsin DNR. You know, he started his career in the DNR, I think, in the late 60s. So he was the one that was here when the salmon program got started. And some of the stuff that I've read about that was that he and Jim Moore started at the same time. I don't know how many of you know Jim Moore, but he's a Sturgeon Bay resident and was the head of the office here in DNR originally. But when they started, they had a boat. They had no nets. They had one boat and a vehicle not big enough to pull the boat. So you're going to hear how he started from that and then helped build the whole salmon program, which includes building some rearing ponds and things like that. And he's a great storyteller, so it'll be a very educational. It'll be a firsthand account about how Chinook salmon and coho salmon got started in Michigan, or I mean in Wisconsin. And then our last one, which will be March 12th, will be Dan Iserman. And we'll hear an update on his acoustic tagging of smallmouth and everything they've learned there. I just got a note from him recently that he just got another 2 years of data that he hopes he'll have analyzed by then. But it'll be a very interesting story about, you know, displacement. When you catch them in one place and you put them in another, do they find their way back? You know, where do they go? And so we'll learn lots there. But going back to Jason Bregeman is a senior fisheries biologist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, who has been at the Green Bay office for the last 4 years. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota, a master's degree from UW Wisconsin Stevens Point, go Pointers, and a PhD from South Dakota State University, all in fisheries management. Now, I first met Jason when the Fish and Wildlife Service in Green Bay hired his wife to do eDNA work. And I don't know how many of you recall, about 4 years ago, we had Dr. Carrie Ann Heyer here to talk about the eDNA program in Lake Michigan to do surveillance about detecting, especially the Asian carp in tributaries in Wisconsin. So that's when I first met him. And actually, we hired him for a little bit, about 8 months, as I understand, before he took a job with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. In fact, I also learned just recently from Jason that Dr. Iserman, that Jason was his first graduate student at Stevens Point when he first came. So it's an interesting family once you get into the Great Lakes stuff, and it's all kind of connected. Throughout his career, Jason has had the privilege to work on fisheries all over the country, from trophy bass fisheries in small ponds in Texas to lake trout on Lake Michigan. Currently, he manages inland fisheries in Brown and Manitowoc counties and the walleye and muskie fisheries in Green Bay. His presentation tonight will focus on the history of walleyes in Green Bay, including their near extirpation, the restoration efforts in the bay, and the ways the walleye fishery is currently being monitored and managed. You will learn about results from a large walleye reward tagging study that started in 2024 that will help managers better understand the fisheries throughout Green Bay. So without further ado, Dr. Jason Bregeman.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for inviting me to come out and talk tonight. I guess one housekeeping item before I start: I'm not going to talk about the history of walleyes in Green Bay tonight. Given how short the time I have to present, I decided to focus all of my attention on how we're currently managing the fishery. So aren't going to talk about the history tonight, but we'll talk about everything that we're doing to currently manage the walleye fishery. And throughout the presentation, you're going to see lots of pictures of people that aren't me. That's by design. I'm merely one person on a large team that works on collecting all the data, processing samples in the lab, et cetera, that's needed to manage the Green Bay walleye fishery. So, you know, that's a way to acknowledge all of the coworkers, volunteers, et cetera, who contribute to this work as well. So Before we talk about how we manage the fishery, I want to give a little introduction to walleye life history in the event that there's some people in the room that are new to fishing, new to the species, as well as some of this is going to be important to how we manage the fishery. So walleye spawn shortly after ice out in the spring on typically clean gravel and cobble when water temps are about 40 to 50 degrees. They provide no parental guarding for the eggs. So if you think of bass, panfish, those species that build nests, and the males will sit there and fan the eggs, keep them clean, keep them well oxygenated, protect them from predators. Walleyes don't do that. They lay their eggs and leave. And the success of hatching, how well those fry survive, that's all basically at the whims of Mother Nature. The parents don't do anything to help them survive. And we'll see when I talk about some of the recruitment that we can see big fluctuations in the success and survival of those eggs and fry through time. So as juveniles and adults, they prefer cool water with low light. They have a structure in their eyes called the tapetum lucidum. That's the reflective layer. If you shine flashlights on them at night, that you see the round eyes shine back at you. That's a reflective structure that helps them to see in low light conditions. So they're adapted to thrive in environments with low light. They'll use a wide variety of habitats as long as they can find good preferred water temperatures, right light conditions, and available food sources, as well as an opportunity to avoid predation, especially when they're small. So anything from rocks, vegetation, reefs, mud flats, and even open water habitat. On a big body of water like Green Bay, it's not uncommon for them to suspend off the bottom out in the middle of the water column, as long as they can find ample food and have the proper temperatures and things. So they're predatory, which means they typically feed on other fish or other critters, frogs, salamanders, things like that. They'll eat on occasion if they encounter them. They typically start to spawn or mature at 3 to 5 years old when they're 14 to 15 inches. Males typically mature at a younger age and a smaller size, whereas the females tend to mature at an older age and a larger size. So the males will typically mature at 3 to 4 years old, the females at 4 to 5 years old. They can live to be 20 plus years old. We've aged walleyes pushing 20 years or older than 20 years in every year that we've collected age samples from the Green Bay population, and they can reach 30 plus inches long. So a little bit of background about walleyes and some of their history. So the rest of my talk is going to focus on how we actually are managing the Green Bay walleye fishery. And my talk is going to largely focus on what we call dynamic rate functions in the fisheries world. There's 3 dynamic rate functions that we monitor as fisheries managers, and those 3 dynamic rate functions are going to what drive changes in the walleye populations. And I'm going to talk about how we monitor each of the dynamic rate functions, some of the results that we have from that, and how changes in those dynamic rate functions have contributed to changes in the adult population in particular in recent years. So what are the 3 dynamic rate functions? The first is recruitment, or simply the addition of new individuals to the population, typically through hatching of eggs in the spring. As those grow up and recruit to the population, reach the sizes that anglers like to catch, we consider that recruitment. The second dynamic rate function is growth. When walleyes hatch, they're barely visible to the human eye, and they grow to be, in the case of the walleye, upwards of 30 inches. So we monitor growth rates, in particular of juveniles and adults. And then the last of the dynamic rate functions is mortality. We typically, as fisheries biologists, are interested in fishing mortality or harvest mortality. It's the source of mortality that we can control through fishing regulations, but not all fish die due to harvest. They'll die of natural causes, old age, diseases, things like that. We mostly manage mortality from a fishing mortality standpoint and use regulations to manage those. So starting with walleye recruitment. So how do we measure walleye recruitment as fisheries biologists? So every fall, my team goes out in the middle of October typically and does electrofishing surveys targeting what we call young of the year walleyes. Young of the year walleyes are walleyes that hatched the previous spring, so they're approximately 6 months old. They're going to be on average 7 to 9 inches long in the Green Bay system. They grow really fast. So they make it to be that large and about 6 months old. So we go out and do our surveys, and this is our indicator of recruitment or indicator of year class strength. So how strong was recruitment in that particular spring? Was the hatch really good? Was there, high success rate where we see lots of those 6-month-old walleyes, or do we not see any 6-month-old walleyes out there? So it's a pretty good indicator of how strong that year class is going to contribute to the fishery 3 to 4 years down the road when they reach the size that anglers like to catch. So my team has standardized stations that we survey on Lower Green Bay and the Fox River, and we've surveyed these standardized stations every fall since 1993. So we have 33 years of data on walleye recruitment on the Green Bay system. Our stations, we have on Lower Green Bay, we have two different stations that add up to about 8 miles of shoreline. One on the east shore from Point Sable all the way down to Comm University Park, and one on the west shore from the tip of Longtail Point up the west side of Longtail Point across the bay and down the western shoreline in Dead Horse Bay. And then we also have about 8 miles of standard transects on the Fox River. We start at the railroad bridge downstream from Highway 172 on both the east and west side of the rivers and follow the entire shoreline basically up to Voyager Park or the base of the dam. So pretty significant amount of effort. It's 16 miles or so of actual pedal time. So our last fall in which we did our electrofishing surveys was this previous fall in 2025, and we shocked about 4 hours of time where we had the electrofishing boat actually on shocking and covered just over 7 miles on our Lower Green Bay stations and shocked about 5 miles and covered about 5 hours and covered about 8.5 miles on our Fox River stations. And across that whole survey, we captured 571 young of the year walleyes. So 571 6-month-old walleyes. 331 of those were in the Fox River. 240 were in Lower Green Bay. We also caught 163 age 1+ walleyes. So anything that's a juvenile or an adult gets grouped into that age 1+ category. So we caught somewhere in the neighborhood of 730 walleyes in that 16 or so miles of shoreline that we surveyed as part of the survey this past fall. So how do we use this data as fisheries biologists? We look at catch rates of young of the year walleyes through time as our indicator of year class strength. So on this graph, we have all the years that we've done the survey on the x-axis. The first year we started these surveys was 1993, all the way through 2025. Our Fox River catch rates are in the white bars. Our Lower Green Bay catch rates are in the black bars, and the vertical axis is going to be our actual catch rate. CPUE is what we call catch per unit effort. It's the number of young of the year walleyes caught per hour of electrofishing. So it's a standardized catch rate by the numbers caught per hour of electrofishing. So the taller the bars, the higher the catch rates, the stronger the year class for a given year. So the first thing I want you guys all to notice, think back to the life history, is we see some years have tall bars, some years have really short bars or no bars at all. It's very common for walleyes to have what we call highly erratic recruitment, where some years we get these really big year classes. The spawn was really good, and other years we have what we call year class failures, where for whatever reason, whether it was weather or poor food shortly after hatching, it was basically a complete lost year class. Very common in walleye fisheries and species that don't provide parental guarding of any of the eggs. So some other things I want to point out. We had a really big year class in 2025, one of the biggest year classes on record. Gotten lots of reports of anglers in the fall as well as throughout the winter that are catching a lot of walleyes in that 8 to 10 inch range, which is a good thing. There should be a really good year class recruiting to the fishery in a couple of years here. So what's been driving some of the more recent trends that anglers have seen in the fishery. So there's one section of the graph that looks different than all the rest, in that we have tall bars in pretty much every year for a 6-year period, from the years 2013 to 2018. And within those 6 years is the two biggest year classes on record, or two of the biggest year classes on record, the 2013 year class and the 2018 year class. Those 6 years of consistent high recruitment in every year is what really drove the big boom in the walleye fishery that everybody remembers from the last 5 to 10 years, where there was just so many walleyes out on the bay. It was because we had such high consistent recruitment year after year after year, with a new year class recruiting into that fishery every single year. Following those 6 years of really good recruitment, we had 3 years of really poor recruitment, including 2 year classes that were essentially complete failures. So the 2019 year class was below average, but still measurable. But these 2020 and 2021 year classes were essentially year class failures. So we had 6 years of phenomenal recruitment, followed by 3 years of poor recruitment. So when you have 3 years in a row where you don't get new individuals recruiting to that population, you're going to see declines in the fishery. We expect that. We expect to see natural fluctuations through time in that fishery. We can't just keep the population going, increasing through time. It has to go through certain fluctuations. But these 6 big year classes were what really fueled that walleye fishery that people remember for, the last 5 to 10 years. Summary on the recruitment. Recruitment in walleye populations is erratic. This is very common. I'm not aware of any walleye fishery in the world that does not have erratic recruitment associated with it. We had a very large year class this previous year, the 2025 year class, that should recruit to the fishery in the next couple of years. We had above average recruitment in all years from 2013 to 2018 in those two, including those 2 giant year classes, followed by 3 years in which we had really poor recruitment or complete year class failures. So that's how we measure the first of the dynamic rate functions, recruitment. Now moving on to growth, the second of the dynamic rate functions. So how do we manage growth? Every spring, my team is out doing electrofishing surveys targeting adult walleyes across all of the known spawning locations. So we have 5 identified spawning locations. I guess we call it 5 categories. The 4 major rivers, the Fox, Oconto, Peshtigo, and Menominee rivers, and then we have a category that we call non-tributary spawners. Most of our effort targeting non-tributary spawners has been in the Sturgeon Bay area, but we have put some effort into other locations farther in Lower Green Bay near Joliet Park and Frying Pan Shoal. So there are non-tributary spawners around the Green Bay system, not just in the Sturgeon Bay area. So when we're out sampling the adult populations, we're able to collect data on the size and age structure of the adult spawning populations in all these locations. We measure and sex all of walleyes that we capture, and we remove a dorsal fin spine for age estimation. So that's a picture of a walleye with one of its spines that we had recently removed. We take a small side cutters and actually snip the spine off of the walleye. We don't pull it out or anything. They don't bleed from it. We just simply snip it off like cutting the end of our fingernail off. They don't regrow like our fingernails do, but we remove a single spine from a subsample of the walleyes for age estimates. Once we are done with our field work, we come back to our lab. We embed all those fin spines in epoxy and cut a really thin section out of the base of those spines. Look at them under a microscope, and this is what they actually look like. You can see the alternating light and dark bands with these dark rings. It's the same premise as counting the rings on a tree, is how we estimate the ages of walleyes and other fish species, as we count rings on calcified bones. So I have the various rings highlighted with orange dots. In this particular With these settings on the microscope, the dark bands correspond to winters. And so the light bands correspond to summertime. So you can count up the number of dark bands or the winter zones to get how old those particular fish are. So I'm going to focus most of my discussion on walleye growth rates from the sample that we collected in the spring of 2024. And the reason is because we did a comprehensive age sample across all of the spawning locations in 2024. So we have the age composition of the entire adult population. Whereas in 2025, we only did the Fox River. We collected spines from the Fox River. So it was a pretty significant effort in the spring of 2024. We removed dorsal fin spines and processed those spines and got ages from nearly 1,800 walleyes across all of the spawning locations. So we have a pretty good data set on the age composition of the entire adult spawning population throughout Green Bay. So once we went through and we sectioned all those spines and estimated ages of them, we can now look at the age composition of the adult fishery. So this is an age frequency histogram. We have our ages on the x-axis, our males in the black bars, our females in the white bars, and we have our percent of sample on the y-axis. Think of this as the percent of the adult population. It's a sample that's representative of the entire adult population. So the first thing that probably jumps out at most people is this really big really high percentage of 6-year-olds in the sample. 6-year-olds make up about 50 to 60% of the males and the females in the sample. If you think back to the recruitment graph, that was the 2018 year class, that last really big year class that we had coming into the adult fishery. The other thing that I want you to pay attention to is how there's a lot more 7 to 11-year-olds than there are younger fish in the population in the adult sample. So part of that is due to these age classes potentially not being quite fully mature yet, but the big driving factor is the fact that these year classes would be the 19, 20, and 21 year classes were the complete year class failures or the really poor year classes. So that's why we don't see those younger age classes in the adult population. So let's look at this a little bit differently. So this is the same graph that I showed you before with our age frequency distribution for the adult population in 2024. I just simply shrunk it down. Now I'll bring in those catch rates from our fall young of the year surveys with the catch rates in a given year lined up directly on top of the age class that would be in the 2024 sample. So the 2022 year class would be 2-year-olds. The 2021 year class would be 3-year-olds. The 2020 year class would be 4-year-olds. And it's a pretty close alignment for the really strong year classes contributing to the really large age classes in that adult population. So in 2024, in our spring surveys, the adult population was dominated by those 6 to 11-year-old walleyes that were from that 2013 to 2018 year classes. We see very few younger, smaller fish in the population because of the poor year classes in those 3 years. There's just not going to be many fish from those year classes contributing to that to the adult fishery. So we did collect another age sample in 2025, but it was only the Fox River across the whole system. We captured nearly 5,000 adult walleyes, and about 1,700 of them were from the Fox River, but we did remove dorsal fin spines from a subsample of walleyes for age estimates from the Fox River. So this was a graph that shows our age distribution from our 2024 sample across the Green Bay system, and I just wanted to bring in the 2025 Fox River sample so we can follow a couple of those year classes through time. So we had the big year class of 6-year-olds in 2024. Those fish are now 7-year-olds in 2025. So they're 1 year older, but they're still the dominant age class in that adult fishery. And we still see, even though it's 1 year older and those younger year classes should have been a lot more likely to mature, they're still absent from the adult population. And they're likely not going to show up in that adult population just because of how poor those year classes are. So we can follow the strong year classes through time. And we do see similar trends in that age composition between our 2 years. So we talked about recruitment. We talked about how recruitment drives the age structure of the adult population. Now let's bring in growth rates and talk about how the combination of the age structure and the growth rates are driving the size structure that we're seeing in the adult population right now. So this is a growth curve for male walleyes, and the dotted line that you see up here is a statewide average growth rate for male walleyes. So it's for all the lakes that we have data on throughout the state. This is the average growth rate for males. And so we have our ages on the horizontal axis and the length at age on the y-axis. So like a 2-year-old male walleye averages about 13, 14 inches. A 3-year-old male walleye, it's hard for me to see at this angle, but somewhere in the neighborhood of, 14 to 15 inches. So if I bring in the growth rates for male walleyes for the Green Bay system, which are depicted by the black line, it shouldn't be that surprising given the amount of forage and productivity in the Green Bay system that male walleyes grow much faster than the statewide average. We see that for a lot of species in the Green Bay system. They have pretty phenomenal growth rates. If we look at it from a female standpoint, male and female walleyes do grow at different rates, with females growing faster. So we oftentimes look at growth rates of the sexes differently. But if we look at the female growth rates, again, this is a statewide average growth curve for female walleyes. So again, a little bit faster, a 3-year-old female walleye might be 15, 16 inches. But if we bring in the growth rate for female walleyes for the Green Bay system, they too grow much faster than the statewide average. So really phenomenal growth rates that we see in walleyes in the Green Bay system. And so just because you have a population of big individuals doesn't necessarily mean it's a population of old individuals given the growth rates. So we'll pair up the strong age classes with the growth curve and see how that, translates into the size structure of the adult population. So in 2025, remember the 2018 year class was the dominant age class in the population. Those are going to be the 7-year-olds. And we have our Green Bay male growth curve. If we draw a line from 7-year-old up to the growth curve, and across to the y-axis, male walleyes that are 7 years old should be about 20 inches long in the Green Bay system, given the Green Bay growth curve. If we look at the actual size distribution of male walleyes in our spring surveys, so this is what we call a length frequency histogram. And on the x-axis, we have half-inch bins, and on the y-axis, we have the number of fish sampled. So, for example, this 14.5-inch bin, these are the number of walleyes between 14.5 and 14.9 inches. These are the number of walleyes between 15 and 15.4, 15.5 and 15.9, etc. So, if I go back to this curve, the dominant age class is those 7-year-olds. They should be about 20 inches. The vast majority of the male walleyes that we're seeing right now in our sample are going to be in that 19 to 21, 22 inch range. There's not a lot of these smaller male walleyes that would be those 4s, 5, 6-year-olds, because those year classes are missing from the population. Same thing with the females. If we do, I'll draw a vertical line up from 7 years old to where it hits the curve and across to see what size that is. 7-year-old female walleye should average about 23 to 24 inches. If we look at the size distribution of what we're seeing for female walleyes in our spring surveys, the vast majority of those fish are 22 to 25 inches. There's virtually no female walleyes less than 20 inches because those are those missing age classes, those 4s, 5s, and 6-year-olds that are absent from the fishery right now. So the age structure in combination with the growth rates are what's driving the observed size structure right now. When anglers are seeing a lot of the bigger walleyes and they're not catching many small walleyes, it's because those year classes that would be contributing the smaller walleyes to the population were poor year classes and are missing from the fishery. So this is a graph showing the male and female length frequency distribution side by side, just so you can get an idea of the differences in growth rates, whereas most of the 7-year-old males are in that 19 to 21 inch range. The 7-year-old females are in that 22 to 25 inch range. So growth summary. We use dorsal fin spines that we collect from spring spawning adults to estimate age structure and growth rates. The 2013 to 2018 year classes are dominating that adult fishery. The 2020 and 2021 year classes in particular are completely missing from the fishery, but the 2019 year class is also really small. Green Bay walleyes grow very fast. And when you have a population dominated by 7-year-old walleyes that's growing fast, you're going to see a population dominated by larger individuals. And it's why anglers aren't catching very many smaller walleyes right now. So 7-year-old walleyes are not terribly old. They can live to be 20 years old. So just like I said before, just because the population is dominated by large individuals doesn't mean it's dominated by old individuals. So the last of the dynamic rate functions, walleye mortality. So again, I'm going to focus mostly on fishing mortality when I talk about walleye mortality. And I think that this is a nice plot that shows changes in the fishery through time, in particular walleye catches and walleye harvest. So we've been doing creel surveys on Green Bay since 1986. Creel surveys are where we send people out to various public access locations and they interview anglers about what they were fishing for, what they caught, what they harvested. And if we get plenty of those interviews, then we can estimate the total number of walleyes caught and harvested by anglers throughout the year. So that's what this plot is showing, is the total number of the estimated number of walleyes caught and harvested by anglers during the open water creel season. The walleye fishery is largely an open water fishery. There's much higher percentage of the population is caught during the open water fishery than the ice fishery. So this is only showing the open water fishery. So what I really want people to focus in on is the last 20 years or so of this graph, where we've seen a pretty steady increase in the estimated number of walleyes caught and harvested by anglers. We've got peaks and valleys, but overall the trend is pretty evident of an upward trend or an increasing number of walleyes being caught and harvested, to the point where in some recent years, 2022, 2023, 2021, kind of the boom of the walleye fishery that anglers remember when there were so many walleyes out there. It was estimated that anglers caught over 328,000 walleyes and harvested over 130,000 walleyes from the population. So I've worked in this office for about 4 years now, and since I started in 2022, anglers have been calling me with concerns that harvest is too high. Anglers are harvesting too many walleyes. We need to change those regulations. And while these numbers are nice, it gives us an idea of the number of walleyes that are being harvested. It's difficult to put these numbers into a population level context. And what I mean by that is when I say anglers harvested 130,000 walleyes, is that 10% of the adult population? Is that 30% of the adult population? Is harvest too high? And so we didn't really have a way to put these numbers into a population level context. So the piece of information that we were really missing is the exploitation rate, or the percent of the adult population that's getting harvested when I say anglers are harvesting 130,000 walleyes. So to get at that exploitation rate, my team partnered with Walleyes for Tomorrow to implement a large reward tag study on the Green Bay system. And how that was going to work is each spring, we were going to try to tag 5,000 walleyes across each of the spawning locations. And I've already introduced those spawning populations, as well as give us the opportunity to collect data on the age and size structure of the adult population, which we covered. The majority of these tags will be yellow non-reward tags, and if an angler reports catching or harvesting a walleye with one of these non-reward tags to my team, they'll get the tagging history of that fish for reporting it. But 200 of these tags, we're going to have red reward tags in them. And if an angler catches a walleye with a red reward tag and reports it to the DNR, as long as they have proper verification and that tag is still valid, they receive $100 from Walleyes for Tomorrow for reporting that tag to us. And those red tags are red, those reward tags, excuse me, are red. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little, some of the details about the red tag. So we're going to implement this tagging study for at least 3 springs and potentially longer, depending on the variability in our estimates. And this study is going to give us a, kind of that population level impact or that exploitation rate, where the percentage of tagged fish that are harvested is equal to the percent of the adult population that's harvested by anglers. The reason that we put reward tags out is those reward tags allow us to correct for non-reporting of those non-reward tags. We know that some of the anglers who catch those yellow non-reward tags are not going to report them for various reasons. They're not interested, they don't have time, and that's okay. We put the reward tags out there because we assume that anglers are not going to pass up on the opportunity to get $100 for reporting those tags. So we assume that 100% of the reward tags get reported. And then we can compare the proportions of reward tagged walleyes reported to non-reward tagged walleyes reported to understand that non-reporting rate and can correct our exploitation estimates for it. So these are the types of tags that we're using. They're called Floy tags. They're a really skinny tag that we put in the fish right next to their dorsal spine. This is one of the reward tags. And I noted that the reward tags have to be valid. The reward tags are valid for approximately 1 year from the time that we put those tags out. And it says on the tag, the valid until date. So there's a date that the tag is valid until. The tags that we put out for the first year of the study in the spring of 2024 were valid until March 31st of 25. And the tags that we put out this previous spring in the spring of 25 are still valid. They're valid until March 31st of 2026. And we're going to put out another round of reward tags this spring that will be valid until March 31st of 2027. So anglers don't have to harvest the fish to get the $100 reward. They can release it as long as they take pictures of the tag, including this 3-digit tag number. Every one of the reward tags has a 3-digit tag number right behind this green bay DNR. So they need a picture of that reward 3-digit reward tag number as verification or proper proof that they caught that reward tag walleye, and they can still release it and get the $100 reward. So some of the results going into the spring of 2024, this was the first year of our tagging study. In that spring, we tagged over 4,500 walleyes. 4,300 had the non-reward tags and 202 had the reward tags. We split our tagging effort up based on the estimated size of the spawning populations in each of the spawning locations. So the Fox River and the Menominee River have much larger walleye spawning runs. They're much larger rivers than the Peshtigo, Oconto, and non-tributary spawning areas. So we put more tagging effort in on these tributaries with the larger spawning runs to keep it a representative sample of the adult population as a whole. So that's the number of fish tagged in each location, and the reward tags were split up in similar proportions. We started tagging on March 4th, 2024 and ended tagging by 4/15. And so the returns of these tags from March 4th, the first day we started tagging, through March 31st, 2025, are going to be the returns that we use for our first year exploitation rate. And then we're going to put a new round of tags out in 25 that are going to be used until March 31st of 26 to get the second year of the exploitation rate. So each spring we're putting out a new round of tags. So some of the results, again, we tagged over 4,500 walleyes. 4,333 non-rewards, 202 reward tags. Of the 4,535 walleyes we tagged, anglers reported catching 172. That's it. Very, very, very few of those. And a tag return does not imply harvest. Tag return simply implies that an angler reported catching that particular fish. So a very low percentage of the tagged walleyes. 161 of the 172 tags were non-reward tags, and only 11 of the 202 reward tags that we put out were returned. Again, they weren't necessarily harvested, they were only returned. When we look at the proportions of non-reward tags to reward tags returned, we get about a 70% reporting rate. Of the 172 tag returns, only 109 were harvested. So 109 of the 4,535 walleyes that we tagged were reported as harvested by anglers in the first year of the study, which equates to about a 5% exploitation rate when we account for non-reporting and tag loss as well. We assume that about 30% of the tags get lost during that first full year. And so we account for that as well. So it's estimated, once you account for tag loss and non-reporting, that anglers harvested about 5% of the adult population during the first full year of that study, which is incredibly low. We typically don't get nervous about exploitation being too high for walleye fisheries until it's up over 20%. 5% is very, very low. When the Winnebago system did their reward tag study, in most years their exploitation rate was up over 30%, following the same study design. So, a couple of other interesting trends. I get a lot of questions about the amount of harvest that takes place during the spring fishery. Green Bay has a year-round fishing season, but in the spring, from the first Sunday in March through the first Saturday in May, the bag limits are dropped to 1 throughout the Green Bay system. But I still get a lot of questions about how much harvest actually occurs during that spring spawning season with the reduced bag limits. So for the first year of the study, that encompassed the dates from March 4th, 2024 through May 3rd, 2024. And then again, that following March 3rd through March 31st of 2025. So about a 3-month period is encompassed in that spring spawning run. And we had 86 total tag returns come in during that time frame. So of the 171 total tag returns, 86 occurred during that spring spawning window. The vast majority of those fish were released. About 60% of them were released, and about 40% of those were reported as being harvested. So 36 of the 109 walleyes, or about 33%, that were reported as harvested for the entire year, came during that spring spawning season with the reduced bag limits. That means that 66% of the harvest occurred during the time when they have the more liberal bag limits, that more summer open water fishery. So about 1.6% exploitation rate during that spring season. So one thing I wasn't expecting that was kind of shocking to me was how different the reporting rates and exploitation rates estimates were based on the tagging location or the spawning stock. So we tagged in 5 different locations, each of the 4 major tributaries, and then the Sturgeon Bay non-tributary areas. And we're going to go through the reporting percentage and then the exploitation in parentheses behind it for each of those stocks. Fox River. Remember, we tagged over 1,500 walleyes in the Fox River. Only 2.7% of those were reported, and the vast majority of those were released. Our estimated exploitation rate for the Fox River spawning stock was just 1.4%. So anglers harvested just over 1% of the Fox River spawning stock. The Oconto River had a much higher percentage of tag returns and a much higher exploitation rate. About 6% of the tags were returned, and our exploitation rate was just under 10%. The Peshtigo River was very similar to the Oconto River, about 4 to 5% of the tags returned, and an exploitation rate just under 8%. Similar with the Menominee River, so we have much higher exploitation of walleyes that spawn on these west shore trips. And then the Sturgeon Bay population, again, was more similar to our Fox River. So the big question is, with this being the largest spawning stock, why is it essentially being unexploited? We'll look at that a little bit more in detail about when the tag returns are coming in from the different locations. So I have the 13 months that made up the first year of our study. On the x-axis. We have our 5 different spawning stocks, the Fox, Oconto, Peshtigo, Menominee River, and Sturgeon Bay areas. And we have the tag returns in each of those months by each of the spawning locations. This is tag returns. It's not necessarily harvest, but we know that each of the 5 spawning areas support really strong fisheries in the spring. That's not very uncommon. We have our June lull, which we've seen in every year since I've been here, when the alewives move shallow to spawn and fishing gets really tough. We have our tag returns really drop off in the month of June. We see that summer fishery pick back up. Fox River, black bars. Fox River spawning stock is essentially absent from that summer fishery. Almost all of the tag returns that were reported during that July and August, that peak of that summer fishery, were from walleyes that spawn in those west shore tributaries. The Fox River has a 28-inch minimum in the spring, so there's virtually no harvest during the spring fishery. It has that 28-inch minimum because of the high contaminant load in the Fox River, and it's largely absent. That spawning stock is largely absent from that summer fishery when those bag limits become a lot more liberal. So that's why we have such a low exploitation rate on the Fox River spawning stock. So when anglers say there's not walleyes out there during the summer, there's a whole Fox River spawning stock out there somewhere that's not being caught or harvested by anglers during that summer fishery, according to our tag returns. So we do see the tag returns tail off. It's interesting that we see the Fox River become the dominant source of tag returns in that fall fishery when anglers move back south to the southern bay and into the Fox River itself. Those are the tag returns from the first ice fishery. We didn't get a single tag return in during the months of December, January, and February. And then we see the return of the spring fishery in March of 2025, predominantly Fox River fish, since that's the first of the spawning stocks to move into the river and get fished in the spring. So I do want to touch base on a couple of highlights from 2025. We tagged just under 5,000 fish again this spring. Notice that we doubled the number of reward tags. Walleyes for Tomorrow was generous enough to let us put out another 200 reward tags so that we could get much better estimates of that non-reporting rate, estimates that we're a lot more confident in. So similar tagging numbers in 2025, where we put most of our tagging effort in the Menominee and the Fox River because these have the bigger spawning runs. We did increase our tagging efforts in the Oconto and Peshtigo rivers just because we saw higher exploitation rates on those spawning stocks, and we wanted to get more confidence in our estimates of exploitation from those tributaries. So we increased our tagging effort a little bit. And then we had just under 350 in our non-tributary locations. So we started tagging on March 12th, 2025 and ended on April 26th. So our tag returns from the spring of 2025 will go from the day we started tagging these fish until March 31st of 2026 for that second year exploitation rate. And again, thanks to Walleyes for Tomorrow for paying the rewards and helping us out with this project. So some preliminary results, because we're not done with the second full year of the study. Again, we tagged 4,900 walleyes. To date, 246 of those have been returned by anglers. Again, only about 5% of the tags that we put out are returned. That doesn't mean that they were harvested. They were simply caught by an angler. Of those 246, 196 were yellow tags. 50 of those were red tags. So we had a big increase in our red tags this year. That lowered our estimated reporting rate down to about 35% so far for the year. And of the 246 tag returns, 129 of those walleyes were estimated as being harvested. So when we account for tag loss and non-reporting, a little higher exploitation rate this year, up to about 10%, but still nothing close to what we would be really concerned with when we start to see that 20% or higher exploitation rate. So some other interesting trends. We've had one part of our spring fishery so far. In a couple of weeks, we'll enter that last month or so of that spring fishery, but we had 137 of the 246 tag returns that have come in so far come in during that spring fishery earlier this spring. And again, about 60% were released and 40% were harvested. So of the 129 walleyes that were harvested, 58 occurred during that spring fishery. So a little under 50% this year, but closer to that 50% of the harvest occurring in that spring fishery, and 50% of the harvest occurring in the rest of that summer fishery. So still under a 5% exploitation rate during that spring spawning season. So nothing significantly alarming from a fisheries management standpoint. So I did want to look at the tag returns by location and spawning stock to see if the Fox River showed up in the summer fishery this year. So same plot that I showed before, just a year later. So we started tagging in March of 2025 and we'll go through March of 2026 for this tagging season. And again, we see all the spawning areas are popular in the spring fishery. We have the June lull. It doesn't appear as though the summer fishery was as good this year, but we actually did get just as many tag returns in during the summer fishery this year as what we did last year. We just got more tag returns in during that spring fishery this year. So, the y-axis for 2024 only went up to about 80, but because we got so many tag returns in March, it looks lower overall, but we did get the same number of tag returns approximately that came in during the summer fishery this year. Again, the Fox River makes up a very small component of that summer fishery. We start to see it make up a little bit of that August fishery, but considering we tagged 3 times as many fish in the Fox River as we did in, let's say, the Oconto or Peshtigo, and the Fox still makes up that few of our tag returns during that summer fishery, it's still largely absent from that summer fishery, certainly not making up the proportion of the total population that it makes up. So move the y-axis back to the full range for that so that you can see kind of how the different months compare to one another with the big spring returns in April and May, but added September and October. And again, we see that Fox River dominate the tag returns in that fall fishery as anglers start heading south. No tag returns in November, and one came in from a fish that was tagged in the Oconto River in December. And I did get 1 or 2 in February that aren't on this graph yet. I didn't get a chance to update the graphs. So last couple of slides. So walleye mortality summary. We're using tagging to estimate the exploitation rate or the percentage of the adult population that's harvested by anglers. It helps us understand the population level impacts of harvest, not just the number of fish that are harvested. So far, annual exploitation rates have been relatively low in that 5 to 10% range. So no significant concerns about overharvest. Part of that could be just the size structure of the adult fishery right now, though, where it's dominated by larger fish that are more likely to get released. We do see the popularity of the spring fishery, but still only 30 to 40 or so % of the harvest occurs during that spring fishery. And again, that could be driven partly by the age and size structure of that fishery, where those larger adults are easier to catch in that spring fishery. Whereas if we had a population that was dominated by 3 or 4-year-olds, you would likely see a lot more of that harvest occurring during that summer fishery, when that summer fishery is dominated by eater-sized walleyes, or what most consider those eater-sized walleyes. So And we do see spawning stock specific exploitation rates where the Fox River is largely absent from that summer fishery. And most of the summer harvest is occurring from walleyes that spawn in the West Shore Trib. So kind of bring it full circle. Green Bay walleye summary and everything I talked about. Walleye recruitment is erratic through time. We see this in pretty much every walleye fishery around the country. We had consistent high recruitment during those 6 years that really fueled the explosion in the walleye fishery. That was followed by below average to poor year classes for 3 years. A population dominated by 7+-year-old walleyes that grows fast is what's driving the population, or what's causing the population to be dominated by larger individuals and very few of those smaller eater-sized walleyes. We did have a really big year class this past year in 25 that should recruit to the fishery in a couple of years. Annual exploitation rates are low. Our tagging study estimated them to be in that 5 to 10% range. And we see a popular spring fishery, but still there's more harvest occurring during the summer fishery or the fishery when there's more liberal bag limits than what's occurring in that spring fishery. Spawning stock exploitation is variable, with the Fox River being a largely unexploited stock. And we're going to continue to use our tagging study to evaluate needs for regulation changes in the future. So that's what I had. So lots of stuff.
Actually, I'm gonna ask the questions first.
Yeah.
So when the Green Bay walleye fishery started, there was there's a lot of stocking to get the numbers up, is that correct?
Yeah, well, the restoration, there was a large restoration effort that took place in the 70s and early 80s where they stocked over 70 million fry and 3 million fingerlings to restore the fishery that had been nearly extirpated from the bay. So yes, there was a lot of stocking.
When's the last time they stocked?
If you count Sturgeon Bay, 2012. There had been some low numbers of stockings in the Sturgeon Bay area since 2012. But outside of Sturgeon Bay, 84 was the last time walleyes were stocked anywhere else in Wisconsin waters of Green Bay.
So all the data you show now are basically from naturally produced fish. Correct. Answered my question. Anybody else?
So I appreciate all the information you shared with all of us. And your data numbers are very interesting. Can I ask a question about charter captains and fishing guides? Since their introduction of reporting their catches, their harvests, has this number been extra important in your numbers with collecting, harvest, overall catching, all that?
So the reward tag study was not implemented and to evaluate guides in any specific way. It was to look at total exploitation. Guide reporting is mandatory. It was implemented, I think, in January 1st, 2022, to get at estimates of guide harvest, in particular during the winter ice fishery, because the guides were using a lot of locations that were not accessible for our Creel program. We do look at the component that guides contribute, at least I do when I manage the walleye fishery, to the overall harvest, the total harvest numbers that we get from our Creel program. And then we look at what the total number that's reported from the guides. And we also ask every tag return that we get if it was caught on a guided trip. And each of the first 2 years, it's been about 5 to 10% of the tag returns have come back as being caught or harvested on a guided trip. And the amount of walleyes that are reported as harvested by guides is in the 5 to 10% of our total harvest estimate. So we do look at the proportion of what guides, and that's a question that we get very often, is what impact do guides have on the population as a whole? And most people are surprised to hear how low. They assume that it's much higher, at least for the walleye fishery, than what our numbers are showing. It's in that 5 to 10% of the overall harvest. Does that answer your question, kind of what you were?
Yes, no, do you feel that it's helped you with your collecting your data as far as mortality, harvest, overall populations? Has it helped you?
Yes.
With your data collecting?
We do. It has helped me with our guide. Having mandatory guide reporting is data that I trust more than estimates from our Creel surveys. So I think the trends that get reported by the guides are more reflective of trends in the potentially in the population as a whole, because of how big of an area that we're trying to cover with and generate estimates for from our Creel program. So yes, I do think that guide reporting could give us more trends. Not that our Creel surveys are terrible estimates, but it's such a big system and they are estimates and we can't be everywhere at once, whereas the guide reporting is mandatory or required by law. So that should be a much more accurate number.
Mhm. And I think it's a great thing. So I just am interested in how
Yes.
this is incorporated into your data collecting.
Yep.
Numbers and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Thank you.
Not on the side. Oh. Good for you.
What time are the walleye most active?
So it depends. The question is, what time are the walleyes most active? And it depends on conditions. People can catch them all day long, but walleyes are known for being most active at low light periods, typically at dawn and dusk. With their reflective layer in their eyes, they can actually feed really efficiently when a lot of their prey species can't see as well. And so they do most of their feeding at dawn and dusk. And people actually fish them all night long on the bay. And in the rivers in the spring, they'll feed all night long in the dark, but people will also catch them during the day, in particular if it's lower light conditions.
I'm gonna try and explain this to you so that you can understand it. I see that your numbers are young of the year, and a lot of that depends on weather conditions. But we have a year class that's 7 years and out. Sooner or later, we're gonna have a year class come through that is not gonna have a lot of capable spawners in it. There's gonna be less fish in it, so it's gonna be young of the years. I'm thinking that even though the weather conditions are some of it, if there's less adult fish to lay eggs, there's gonna be less young of the year. So, and some of the numbers that you're showing are maybe a little bit different here on the east shore, because we aren't seeing those numbers. And when you see a Creel census girl that says, do you have a walleye? And we say, we have one. She said, can I see it? Because I haven't seen one in 3 weeks. And that was from Trudeau's dock and Bayshore that she did. Do you see a need for a 3-fish limit to leave more adults in to spawn and get the population, especially on this side, necessary? Say an emergency, no closure.
All right, so the question is, oh, there we go. So question is, I think you are getting at that there's not a lot of adult walleyes, and your concern is that too few adult walleyes is going to mean not many babies, right?
Well, we're the people that catch fish and want them are gonna take them out of that 7-year class, so there's gonna be less of those. And the recruitment from the years that you showed there were almost non-existent young of the year, there's not gonna be any in there at all. So we're gonna have a gap in there of capable spawning adults. So if we could keep some of the adults, instead of catching 5 and keep 3, we would leave more adults in the system to keep the spawning level up.
Yeah, so there I guess the easiest answer to that is the number of adult walleyes has very little impact on spawning success. And I think we would all agree. What is?
I don't know.
It's like iPhone.
Oh,
I don't know.
Is your mouse working?
Yeah,
There was a bar that said iPhone for just a
but
second.
I don't know whose iPhone is right, but anyway. Environmental conditions are what are the primary drivers of the success of walleye recruitment. It's the adult population has very little impact on it. And I didn't get into all the research projects, but we have an ongoing research project with Stevens Point that they took these 33 years of data and looked at what environmental factors were, what food resources were from our trawl and all these things. And what they concluded is the vast majority of walleye recruitment is driven by winter severity and springtime flows. It's very little to do with the number of adults, and that's consistent across the vast majority of walleye populations, is that it's driven by environmental factors. So yeah, we will have a couple of year classes missing from the adult population, but it certainly won't be to the point where there isn't going to be more than enough adults out there to spawn, because we've got adults that live to be 20 plus years old in the system. And I think we would all agree that there were a lot more adults in these years, and despite those numbers of adults that were out there spawning, it was a complete year class failure. And then you look at what happened in 2025 when those year classes are already missing from that adult population. We still pulled off one of the biggest year classes of all time. So no, I don't think there's a need for an emergency 3-bag rule right now to protect some of those adults, because especially if our exploitation rates are 5 to 10%, it's not going to save that many walleyes to the point where there's going to be, that would tip the adult spawning population to where spawning would be that much better, especially given when it's controlled by the environment so much.
But you are saying that if there's less eggs laid, that isn't gonna affect the end of the year?
Correct.
Yes.
It's each female walleye has tens to hundreds of thousands of eggs in it. And so typically it's not poor spawning and poor success, poor year classes have nothing to do with the number of eggs laid and everything to do with the environmental conditions in that year.
Let's go on the other side. Any more over here? Okay. I'll get you next.
This graph very much reminds me of similar ones that I've seen with oak trees with mast ears for acorns, and that it's very much of an environmental effects with the show what trees actually grow. So I think it's very similar to that. It's not how many acorns, but the environment.
Yep.
Like,
Thank you.
You essentially answered my question already, because their careers are so long as spawners that if that whole group as it goes through will persist for 15 or 20 years of productivity, so to speak. So yeah, it's just amazing how much the environment has an effect on this.
I thought I saw at some point that there was something in the chat, but I don't know how to.
Yeah, well, actually, if those on Zoom would like to ask a question, just unmute yourself and ask it, and we'll be able to hear it. Right there.
so the good news is starting this.
So would anybody like to?
I think there was one person in there, if you go up to the top. Up at the layering is the screen share, if you go all the way up. There was
There we
one
go.
person in the chat.
Yeah, I think that was, I just looked at that. That was a comment,
Oh,
said thanks.
Yep.
So anybody on Zoom want to ask a question? Please do. In the meantime, I'm gonna get Mr. Burke on.
So what are the key environmental factors that affect the success rate of a swan?
Winter severity and spring flows. So winter severity largely has to do with the timing of when the walleye spawn and lining up the hatching with available zooplankton for food. Walleyes have about 3 days of egg yolk reserves after they hatch before they need to feed on zooplankton. And if it's a really poor winter and the spawn is really early, they tend to hatch before many of the zooplankton blooms. The other factor is flows, and that's to keep the eggs clean while they're in the gravel and cobble, as well as to keep oxygen flowing over those eggs. So those are the two dominant factors in Stephen's Point's recruitment modeling that really drive success. And if you look at well, I still don't know what made those goofy arrows, which is bizarre. In spite of this. So if you think about the 6 years that are circled there, we went from some of the lowest bay levels on record to some of the highest bay levels on record, and record rainfall and snowfall in a lot of those years that really had significant spring flows. We also had some of the best ice conditions back in those years. I mean, I think it was 2018. I needed auger extension on my ice or auger because it was so thick. And then we also had that big April blizzard in 2018 that ended up dumping all that snow that melted and caused really significant flows during that walleye spawning time. So it's largely winter severity and spawning that are the big, flows that are the big drivers.
So a more severe winter is actually better for the spawning success. Which would make sense, the last 2 winters before that were. Right.
Which actually, high ice cover helps whitefish spawn better as well, survival. So a regular winter, like we've been having, that's gonna change here. It's not a bad thing when it comes to fish.
It doesn't make any sense for the 25, the good recruitment we had in 25, because last year's winter was like one of the worst. Only off the ice before the 1st of March.
So the winter severity metric is the number of days where the average temperature is below 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was a later spawn based on all of our data that we had. If you remember when we started tagging last year, it was 10 or 12 days later than 2024. And we actually didn't finish until later in April. But last year was one of the first good ice years that we've had in quite some time, from what I can recall. And we also had higher flows in the rivers this past spring too. So, do you have a question?
There's a question.
Bob's question.
Should we be heavier in stocking at Ramble? Recruitment for 2 years. Modifier and stocking. I'm not sure what that.
I'm not sure either.
Maybe he missed that there isn't stock.
Yeah, because we haven't stocked.
No, we haven't stocked in anywhere outside of Sturgeon Bay, in 40+ years. And so this is all natural recruitment, no stocking. I don't know if that answers the question, measuring natural recruitment.
What if he's trying to say, or he, I guess, that we should have stocked when we saw we had such low recruitment in those years. But you're not gonna make up for the natural reproduction.
No. Should we be stocking? No, I mean, there's more than adequate enough natural reproduction going on we expect there to be erratic recruitment. Even if we stock, there's no way that we could come even close to replicating what Mother Nature does. If you think back to the creel chart that in the peak of the fishery, anglers were catching 300,000 walleyes a year and harvesting over 100,000. I mean, we couldn't even come close. If you think about maybe 10% of stocked fish survive, that would mean that we would have to stock 1 million fingerlings a year, and we just wouldn't have come close to the hatchery capacity to raise something like that, to sustain those kinds of levels. So, yeah, there was a blip in the recruitment, but, you know, we expect populations to fluctuate. They're not gonna increase forever. And we do, particularly the 2025 year class is a good year class. So I didn't get into a lot of the details, but, again, for some of the time, but one of the interesting things that I have talked about in presentations before is why we have big year classes in 22 and 23 in the Fox River and not at our Green Bay sites. And our current working hypothesis is that there were good year classes in the Fox River those years, but poor year classes in the West Shore tributaries. And that's why we had higher catch rates in our Fox River sites, but really poor catch rates in our Green Bay proper sites. And we're going to monitor the adult population moving forward to see where we start to see these 2022 and 2023 year classes show up, if they show up in that adult fishery in the next year or two.
I don't need that. Well, it helps. Okay, they've been planting a lot of muskies. Is that any effect on our walleye population?
So the number of muskies that we're planting is relatively low compared to the number of walleyes. And what we see is that most of the best muskie fisheries in the state are also the best walleye fisheries in the state. They tend to use different habitats, and so they don't overlap as much. And so muskies more often feed on things like suckers. And I'm not saying they won't eat a walleye, but they tend not to eat walleyes. And we see that around the state, that typically, you know, where we have good walleye fisheries, we also tend to have good self-sustaining muskie fisheries. So they don't tend to displace one another.
Okay.
Do the invasive species affect the walleye growth and population?
They can, you know, gobies are notorious egg predators. But on the flip side of that, you know, gobies are a benthic fish that walleyes tend to spend a lot of time on the bottom, and we know that walleyes will eat gobies. So, I mean, in certain circumstances, they can, you know, hinder through egg predation, but they can also potentially benefit the species by providing an additional food source near the bottom. So I guess it depends. You know, we haven't seen any evidence that or invasive species are, you know, like threatening the persistence of the walleye fishery or anything. So.
I could ask you, do you test the water at any given time during the time when you are looking to predict, or do you predict because of water testing, like for oxygen levels, flow rates and so on, and say, oh, we're gonna have a crappy year coming up because of what we just found as low oxygen levels, and we're not gonna survive the hatch?
So we just developed these models, so we haven't used our recruitment models to predict whether or not we think it's going to be a strong or a weak year class based on spring conditions. But, you know, we use more stationary systems, like the U.S. Geological Survey has gauges on the rivers that are continuously monitoring flow and oxygen, and we use those gauges because, you know, those are more reflective of all-encompassing conditions, whereas, you know, we're only out there a few days a year, whereas those eggs are subject to conditions 24 hours a day and such. So we typically rely for these types of metrics on like those gauging stations that are active all the time.
Jason, I got a question that came through my phone, but there's a lot of guys in this room that chase like trophy walleyes. And based upon your age at size at age graph you had, it showed that there's almost, from your sample size, there's almost no 30+ inch walleyes out there. How rare is that for these people that are catching 32 to 34 inch walleyes? And do you have any age structures in your archives for fish that are of that size?
Still don't know why there's goofy stars or arrows
Yeah, that's the question.
or whatever. So, we do catch 30-inch walleyes pretty much every year. So this is our females from 2025. And, we handled over 2,000 females, so it doesn't look like a lot. But they're out there. We handle 5 to 10 a year out of 2,000 to 2,500 female walleyes. Now, as far as growth, why doesn't it? In my show. I wanted to go to the growth curve.
I don't know, what'd you do?
I don't know. This is why I started.
I don't know, maybe this is the end.
I broke the internet.
That's a good question. Well, if we stop sharing, we should be able to come here, so at least we can see it here. We go.
So,
So before you get started, let me see if we can share it again. So that you can see it on Zoom.
I guess the question is, what's one of the oldest walleyes you've aged?
so
based
we,
on the structures.
21 is the oldest that comes to mind. We see a handful of walleyes, 15 to 20 inches a year. And so this is the average growth rates. And so like the average size that females top out at on the Green Bay system when they're about 20 years old is, they're gonna let me. So at 20 years old, or at 19 years old, they're 28.3 inches on average. And at 20 years old, they're 28.4 inches. And some females only make it to 26, some grow to 31 or 32. So I don't know, I don't have an exact number of what proportion of, 15-inch walleyes are gonna make it to that size. But the average maximum size is gonna be in that 28 to 29-inch range.
So, through all this newer data that you're collecting, are you ever going to the point where you can estimate population size?
Perhaps we could try to build a catch at age model that would try to get to that, but it becomes challenging to get population estimates without more like commercial sampling to really get commercial catch rates and pop estimates. We would have to rely more on like mark recapture, and it's such a big system without like a catch at age model. It would be very, very difficult to do a mark recapture population estimate. So that's why we use tags as like a representative of the percentage of the adults that are sampled or caught.
With Mother Nature cooperating, proper water temperatures from egg fertilization to incubation, what's the average time period between that? do you have that?
10 to 20 days is typically what it takes for eggs to, from the time they're fertilized and laid till they hatch.
Okay.
So it's relatively short.
It's pretty quick for walleyes.
Okay, as the non-fisherman in the room, I'm the cook and you refer to eater fish. What size is the perfect size for an eater fish of a walleye?
That depends on the person. It's highly variable, but we see in our data, you have most walleyes that anglers catch that are less than 20 inches get harvested. About 50% of the walleyes between 20 and 24 inches get harvested, and almost everything 25 inches and up gets released based on our data. So they prefer to eat, walleyes less than 20 inches. And we'll, about 50-50 in those walleyes in the low 20s.
More questions? We're good. Well, let's give Jason a big hand. That's quite a bit of walleye.
I do have business cards up here. If people have additional questions, if they want to reach out, we can talk about things more.
Thank you all for coming. We'll see you in 2 weeks for Lee Kerner. Thank you.
Is this what I'm supposed to do?
I will, I gotta get the, but you can get it on the, I will. You can get it.
Thanks for coming. Yeah. My plan.